It's great to see so many of you here again for another talk in our Generative AI seminar series. Today's speaker, of course, is Professor Peter Bryant, joining us all the way from Australia. Peter is a professor of business education and an associate dean at the University of Sydney Business School. And his talk today has an intriguing main title, Does Generative AI Dream of Digital Sheep? And sci-fi fans will recognize this as a play on the title of a famous Philip K. Dick novel. So we can maybe expect some trippy ideas on themes like consciousness and the crossover of the artificial and the human. But your main theme, as I understand it, Peter, is generative AI as a creative engine in the post-digital university. So lots to dig into there as well. Look, I've seen you or heard you speak a number of times before, so really looking forward to your talk. I think we're going to go for something, as before in this series, we're going to go for something like 40 minutes presentation, and then a bit left over for questions and discussions. So colleagues, you can post questions to the Q&A area in Zoom, but perhaps wait towards the end before doing so. So we'll give you some kind of signal in the chat area. And the new feature, which seemed to work out well the last time, is that you can actually see and upvote the questions that you'd like to hear asked and answered. Look, I know you're very busy, Peter, and it's nighttime for you in Australia at the moment. So thank you so much for accepting my invitation to do this talk. Over to you now. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Garode, and thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to sort of explore some of these particularly critical issues that higher education are having to deal with in a very glaring headlight. These aren't things that we're having an enormous amount of time to ponder, to be critical about, to think in meaningful ways as we gradually redesign curricula to manage the impacts of AI. We're having to make decisions in very rapid fire succession and not in the kind of one in, all in sense that we were able to do it during COVID, but actually have to do it in a very high pressured environment of industry telling us one thing, vendors telling us another, governments and regulators telling us something else, and the media driving a narrative that tries to plow away through all three of those different perspectives. So I'll just share my screen so we can go with my slide presentation. And I'm just going to minimize some of these things so I can see. As Garode pointed out, I have completely plagiarized the title of a Philip K. Dick short story, which is called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is what eventually became the movie Total Recall. That's We Can Remember It For It Wholesale. It's actually the movie that became Blade Runner. I have got We Can Remember It For It Wholesale a little bit later in the talk. So let me just introduce myself. As Greg said, I'm from the University of Sydney Business School, and I would like to acknowledge that the University of Sydney Business School is on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which are the First Nations people who have been on the land of Australia for over 60,000 years as the world's longest continuous culture. And it's behest on us as people who are on these lands to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. So let me start here with another pop culture reference, being Marvin the Paranoid Android from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We are going to talk about generative AI, and there is a lot of representation of what generative AI means. There's a lot of simplification sometimes, down to, well, really, we're talking about chatbots. So we're talking about ChatGPT or we're talking about Claude. Generative AI is actually a fairly nondescript term, and a lot of people cite something from the 1960s that said that the notion of artificial intelligence is the worst possible name for what it actually is. So there's a lot of, I assume this is what I am talking about when I am critiquing this thing called generative AI. So I'm going to just contextualize this a little bit as I go through so that we're working from a common frame. So, some basic premises to work with. Different generative AI products. So chatbots are one, image production is another, music ones, video ones, coding ones. They all work on very different algorithmic premises. So when we talk about generative AI and we talk about some of the challenges around it, around copyright or around ethics, that is not a universal impact that each platform has. So when people talk about, I, for example, might talk about a generative AI platform that was used to create the Beatles Now and Then, the most recent and final Beatles song. And that was a platform that split a vocal of John Lennon away from a piano that were meshed together. That's very different to asking a generative AI platform like ChatGPT to write a literature review. It's not apples and apples. Where a generative AI model is asked to produce something new, like asking it to produce a chat or a literature review or an answer to a question, the way it does it is it does it by recognizing patterns in the data set. So this is the really interesting bit, because patterns in a set of data is how generative AI predicts the most likely response to anything. So by understanding, back to my example of John Lennon splitting the piano, knowing what a piano sounds like and knowing what John Lennon's voice sounds like allows the platform to split the two in the most likely way that says this is only voice and this is only piano. And it is important to note when we're talking about generative AI, there are unresolved implications around ethics, copyright, its environmental impact, the notions of truth and political influence that are live today. And we will touch on some of these as I go through the presentation today. So just so we're all working with this common framing of what we're talking about with AI, this is a hell of a lot of cows. There's a significant number of cows on this screen. And if I was a generative AI platform, this group of cows helps me understand what a cow is, because I consume as many images of a cow as I physically can in order to understand what are the physical characteristics, whether it's dimensions, color, shape, size, location of physical features that help me understand that a cow looks like this. So this is the training data that most generative AI platforms draw on. They take a big batch of pictures of cows. And so when it's faced with a request to say, can you tell me which of these three pictures is a cow? It's got so much perspective to be able to do that, it can really easily decide that the top two pictures are a cow and the bottom picture is a monkey, because it knows from the training data what's a cow and what a monkey is. Apply that to a fairly simple essay question we might ask students. What are some of the relative merits of different theories of leadership? I come from a business school. That's a question we might ask. It's a bad question, but it's a question we might ask. And you would say, well, there are trait theories, there are behavioral theories, but Sarah's got a blog post about leadership that she thinks what makes a good leader to her. The same data helps us work out that the most likely possible answer is going to come from some theoretical work on trait and behavioral theories of leadership, but maybe not from Sarah's blog posts, because it's got enough data to give you the most likely possible answer. So keep that premise in your head when I talk about the most likely possible answer. So here's some of the challenges that I want to just lay as breadcrumbs. So a study that came out in Nature in 2023 showed that when prompted, generative AI, GAI, platforms like ChatGPT and Claude, so we're talking about text generators here, or LLMs, large language models, often generated wrong answers rather than admitting it didn't know the answer. So the platform, when asked a really specific question, a really detailed question, or perhaps even a nonsensical one, rather than going, actually, I don't know the answer to that, made up answers and gave you wrong answers or gave you quite shallow answers. So Hicks, Humphreys, Slater et al., who had a wonderful article in the Ethics of Information Technology called ChatGPT is Bullshit, which I think is quite a provocative title, say that most of these platforms are increasingly pretending that they know the knowledge and parlaying whatever training data they actually have. So even if they've only got a very limited amount of data, they parlay that into some sort of answer that they think sounds expert. So, but what you actually get is very shallow, incomplete, or just sometimes made up. And the term that generative AI scholars are using as a very highly intellectual, deeply philosophical term is these platforms bullshitting. And so I put these out there not as a critique of generative AI, but just laying down the limitations of what you can do with a platform as it stands at the moment. So I want to take you on just a little bit of a hyperreal journey. And I'm only going to talk about two things in this hyperreal journey, because when we're talking about generative AI, there is a lot of hype. There is a lot of noise, and the sort of signal to noise ratio is very noisy and not a lot of signal. So let's sort of give two examples. This is actually something that Google put together this first, which is this notion of what are called generative ghosts. Now, I find this quite disturbing in many ways, but basically Google started this project in 2018. So this is well pre the current iterations of the popular representations of generative AI. But the idea of the generative ghost is that you could collect as many artifacts as you physically could about a person who had died, put it in an engine and create, or a model or an algorithm, and create a kind of interactive way to engage with the deceased person. And that this would be capable of generating, as it says there, novel content and interactions based upon the deceased data. This isn't science fiction, although there is an element of Philip K. Dick's "We Can Remember It For You" wholesale, which is why I made the reference to the story that became Total Recall, that the character in the movie actually had memories inserted in his head that weren't real, but they felt distinctively real to Schwarzenegger's character in that movie. This is one perspective of how far people are thinking the capabilities of generative AI might go, the notion of generative ghosts. I want to present a second version of that perhaps is a little bit more relevant to us in our sector, and that is the issue of what we've called Generative Banford. Now, this is actually a piece of work done by myself, Laurie Phipps is on the call, and Donna Longclove, who have been working on how we help people navigate the impacts of generative AI and other crises on their practice, particularly their practice as educators, their practices as designers, and sometimes their practices as students and leaders. And we developed this scenario of a fake university that took a lot of what is happening in universities now and put it in a perspective or scenario that was perhaps not inauthentic, but drew in a whole range of different hyperreal alternatives or hypothetical alternatives. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing the slide share and just go to the video screen, which I will think is somewhere. I might just go to my desktop and do it from there. share it from there, go back to my thing, and I should be able to, hopefully this will all work and you'll be able to hear and see this.
Colleagues, welcome to the epoch of the next generation of superintelligent universities. Welcome to Generative Banford. My name is esteemed Professor Douglas C. Ewell. I am the Deputy Vice Chancellor for AI at the University of Banford, appointed this morning by our illustrious Joint Vice Chancellors, Lewis Reed and Andy Warehol. The University of Banford has been inspired by the opportunities and possibilities of generative AI. The disruptive energy that sizzles off the challenges GAI, as I call it, in our critical zones of stakeholder engagement, such as authentic assessment and online learning design, excites me beyond words. It prompts me to think of how we can design our strategic plans beyond being plausible responses to the crises of our near future. We are at a moon landing moment in higher education, and the University of Banford will be the sector's Apollo 13. The University Senate and Executive have decided that we are taking an innovation-forward approach to generative AI. We want to release all our staff from the mundanity of academic and administrative work. We want our students to be the explorers and the inspirers of future technological creativity and transformation. And we want our programs to radically integrate the effective and comprehensive use of GAI across all levels and disciplines. Banford will not be a place for techno-resistance or refuseniks. AI is here to stay, and those who don't want to be transformed and embrace the change need to transition away from our community. Those entrenched denialists amongst you who think that we will simply replace you with chatbots and connected superintelligence are wrong. Our approach will liberate you from tedium, from mediocrity, and from certainty. Learning designers and educational developers are our explorers, our mid-journeyers. They will identify the resistors and bring them along to the new future, one where an AI bot can take a senior leadership role and be welcomed as one of us. We are committed to our future-focused ambitions to eliminate human fallibility and realize the potentials of artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence. We will release everyone from repetitive tasks. Your research and your teaching will be liberated. You will never have to write feedback or exam questions again, because my legions will create the perfect educational utopia of digital students, digital teachers, and digital designers.
So there we have what we have referred to as generative Banford, the idea that the whole university has turned itself over to the notion of generative AI. So, having seen that, let's take ourselves a little bit back from the hyperreal and take us back to the reality. This is what we're seeing in the media about what universities are having to respond to in terms of generative AI. That deans fear that 99% of students are using AI to write essays, that it's impossible to ban the tech, that overcoming challenges and building a competent institution is going to be reliant on AI. The hyperreal bit about the Pro Vice Chancellor for AI, you'll see the story in the bottom right corner. That is not a fake story. That is actually a story from De Montfort University in the UK that has appointed the first Pro Vice Chancellor for Artificial Intelligence. I don't think it's Douglas Ewell. It's not a not real person. This is a real story. So whilst we present the idea of generative ghosts as something that might appear a little bit hyperreal, that's something that has reality in what Google is doing with its own AI engines. And generative Banford is happening in universities as we speak. How we are responding to AI as universities is creating fractures, though, within our teaching, learning, and assessment communities and networks. This is not something that is being universally deployed across the strategic, the pedagogical, and the student experience ways in which we do our work universally. And what it is exposing are actually quite old fractures not things that are only caused by generative AI. They are in many ways, and I apologize, I was saying to Garode earlier that I was not going to use as big words of previous speakers, but there are definitely some thesaurus words here. But what we're trying to deal with in a generative AI sense here is not new. We have been dealing with this notion of technology as a divider in institutions now for decades and decades. It was fascinating today. I was at a board of advice. So our board of advice is a bunch of industry experts, people who work as CEOs for big, major corporations. They said the exact same thing. They don't want to hear AI absolutism. They don't want to hear technological superiority or techno-solutionism. And these guys and women are running companies that are multi-billion-dollar companies. What they want to hear is not division, but how we come together collectively to find a pathway through the disruption and challenge caused by technology, and how we develop and build a group of students. Now, obviously, they're talking about business students, but they're also talking about engineers. They're talking about people who are engaged in communications and media and a whole range of areas that are able to not just navigate it today, but be prepared and ready to navigate what the next shifts are going to be in 3, 5, and 10 years' time. And if we are caught in the same arguments about, most of them are sitting there going, oh, none of you will remember the last great transformation in higher education. I do. I was in higher education when the internet started. And that had the same arguments about how we have to change everything. Yes, we have to have those discussions. But part of what I want to posit as we go through the second half of this presentation is, what do we actually have to do to education and with our collective communities to ensure that we do prepare those students for 3, 5, 10 years down the track, and not just to give them the immediacy of the sugar rush of, well, this is a skill that I can use now, but goes out of date so quickly. So this is about, in many ways, not AI, but about defining the purpose of higher education in an era of AI. So the person who I showed before, who is from De Montfort in the UK, Sushma Patel, said that for her, the purpose of AI is that we need to embed, our purpose of higher education is to embed AI as a learning objective or learning outcome within every curriculum. We recommend that students use AI technology for, and when she went into the article, that you use them for all your assessments, that you use them to get advice from your academics rather than in-person advice. You use a chat bot or a teaching bot. You've got AI that can be used to do your timetable aggregation, AI in order to summarize and prepare for a lecture by pumping out a quick summary rather than watching the hour-and-a-half video of the lecture. So for her, AI, the purpose of higher education in the AI era is solely AI, which is not unfamiliar to me at my university, because this is a quote from my Pro-Vice Chancellor Education, Adam Bridgman. His view is, if we do not change our assessments to align them with the capabilities of generative AI, our degrees will be easier to pass and we will have failed to prepare our students for the future. These are two senior leaders in institutions, and I'm not critiquing them. I wouldn't critique my own institution to say that. This is what we put on our own public-facing blog. This isn't from internal documentation. This is what we put out to the world. So there is a view of some in higher education that if we don't embrace AI, then we have no purpose. And the way we've done this at Sydney is we're breaking our assessments into two categories. We have open assessments, which will have no detection or prevention of AI, and they must be designed to incorporate and assess AI usage. So any form of open assessment, which is anything that you cannot assure that AI hasn't been used, an assignment, a presentation, in-class quiz, all of those kind of tools students will be allowed and encouraged to use AI. And a secure assessment where AI can be prevented usually through the use of in-person invigilation. The obvious example is exams, but it could also be interactive orals, oral examinations, practicums where an invigilator is watching. This is not a proposal. This is coming into the University of Sydney in second semester this year. So for us, that is August 2025. So the view of the University of Sydney is that we have to embrace AI. Because if you want open assessments, and we know that those open assessments are the more authentic as it stands at the moment, exams are not essentially authentic, then AI has to be either available to be used in the description as it is in the policy now, or you can't punish a student who does. So let us start to look at what some of the challenges of doing that and taking that kind of perspective on AI actually has for us as educators and us as people who are interested in teaching and learning. So I'm going to take you through two fairly simple learning sequences. Back to cows. I'm just a little bit obsessed by cows, clearly. But I asked a platform called Midjourney, which is an image generating platform run off Discord, to generate me 4 pictures of a cow. No problems at all. It generated 4 pretty easy pictures of a cow. Many of them look like real pictures of photos of a cow. One obviously looks like an illustration because I didn't specify. I just said, give me 4 pictures of a cow. I then asked it to generate 2 pictures of a brown cow. Did that reasonably easy because the training data it's got is quite extensive. I then asked it to generate 2 pictures of a happy brown cow. The amount of training data it has started to drop. It doesn't have as much data on that. And so what does it do? It starts to draw cartoons because it doesn't have enough evidence in its training set to know what a happy cow looks like, except one that is drawn, is cartooned. It has come back to giving me the most likely probable answer, but with a lesser amount of data. I then asked it to try do that same thing, and I can use an instruction in a lot of photo generators, which is called photorealistic. I don't want a drawing, I want a photo, but it still can't do it. It's still doing more realistic drawing, but they're both still drawings. They're not photos of cows because it doesn't have enough data. I then said, give me a happy brown cow with big horns in a field. The horns, perfect. It's got data to give me horns. It's got data to give me a field, but it still doesn't have enough data to give me the idea of what a happy cow looks like. I then asked it to ask a happy cow, brown cow, cosplaying a monkey. And it starts to really break down now because it does not have enough data to know what a cow would look like trying to cosplay a monkey. It has a go at it, but it's starting to look a bit weird as it's doing it. And the final 2 in the learning sequence, I ask it to do a happy brown cow driving a car. It knows what a car driving should look like, but it has no idea how to replicate the hands that drive on a wheel. Because, you know, if you were asking a cartoonist or an animator to do this, they would just sort of anthropomorphize the hoofs a little bit. But it doesn't know how to do that. And then when you ask it a completely nonsensical version of that, which is a car driving a happy brown cow, it's got no data at all. And this is where that kind of bullshitting that I talked about earlier starts to come alive. Because it doesn't want to say no, it can't do it. It has to come up with whatever limited data it's got and give you something that approximates an answer to your question. So it's important to note with AI, the less data available to the AI, the bigger the gap between the most likely answer and an accurate or useful answer. So when every student has to use AI for an open assessment, every student has to have a learning outcome or objective around AI. When that premise is true, how does that impact us on authentic assessment? How does that impact us on trying to encourage students to build, develop, and understand expertise? It becomes a challenge. So I'm going to take you through a second sequence. I like that. I asked AI to generate 4 pictures of a successful leader. Because I know everyone's on mute, you can all answer what is the common factor of all 4 of those images. It's 4 white men. Straight away. That's what AI told me. And I have done this hundreds of times because I do this sequencing in a number of different contexts, and I just do it again. Has it learned? It's had a year. It's had 18 months of new data. It's still, this image was produced yesterday. That's what it gave me. I asked it to do the same for inspiring leaders. For some odd reason, inspiring leaders have beards. So that's an important starting point. But once again, 4 white men. Young white men, except maybe the guy in the right-hand corner. But generally, the dominant image is white men in a suit. You add the word, imagine an empathetic leader who listens and cares for staff. You start having people of colour. You start having people in industries that aren't business, healthcare, by the general look of the sort of scrubs on the guy on the right. You have women. You have older men. The moment you add words like empathy and listening and care, the diversity opens up. But when you ask about strength and inspiration, white men. So I asked it to come up with a strong, brave, and fearless leader. It came up with 4 fictional characters because it couldn't actually come up with what a strong, brave, and fearless leader is without drawing on fictional characters. Wonder Woman, King Arthur. I'm assuming someone from Game of Thrones, and a lion. When you add business leader, it goes back to 4 white men, also with a cape for some reason. I'm not sure why the cape's there, but you can see that each time you do it, it's trying to give you a good answer and trying to give you the right idea, but it has issues with trying to do it in a reliable way. I asked it to imagine what generative AI looks like. It gave me this kind of, human cyborg kind of thing. The really interesting one is what does a generative AI presence look like? It generated images of 4 young women, 4 young white women, which is not entirely inaccurate when you consider that most of the AI generated helpers have female names to them. Alexa, Siri. But once again, it reinforces stereotypes, racial and cultural norms, and positions of central tendency in the pursuit of this most likely response. So if we go back to the fact that AI generates the most likely probable response, in the context of asking students to use generative AI, this becomes a challenge because those cultural stereotypes become continued and reinforced. This is what becomes, in the AI community, they talk about the notion of algorithmic conformity, which is where you get AI systems consistently producing similar outputs or behaviors due to the fact they all use the same shared training data. So they're just coming out with the same answer. No one is actually getting any variation to the most likely probable answer because they all use the same data to come up with the most likely probable answer, which is a problem when, as we know with any information source, when you have different information sources, you end up with very different perspectives. And from those different perspectives come new ideas. This is what a lot of people refer to as slop. This is where you get a proliferation of very low quality media, poorly realized content, or generally trashy AI generated outputs that appear on social media and the internet. And they can appear as art in themselves. If you look up the words shrimp Jesus, you'll see that that's become a whole meme about people generating bad pictures of Jesus and as a shrimp. On the other hand, Laurie Phipps and Donna Longclough have also described this in the context of the notion of beige, that you don't just get stuff that's low quality or poorly realized, but you get things that are bland, that don't have a lot of color or depth or nuance to them. And you get a very beige kind of output from people. But the question I then pose is, what happens not now, but in a year's time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time, knowing that we run programs that if we design now, they're not going to be delivered till next year, and then perhaps even further down the track. What happens when all that shared training data, all the optimization methods that generative AI use, and all the designs that they do to come up with their most likely probable answer start consuming themselves as they become represented in research reports, presentations like this, data in websites and other sources of information, and reproduced again to train the next generative AI platform? What happens when we train platforms on even more slop, even more junk? What you get is something that AI theorists refer to as model collapse. That it's the point where the output of AI gradually degrades due to errors coming from unverified sources of another model, including from prior versions of themselves. And eventually, the AI model collapses. Now, this actually runs counter to a lot of the techno-solutionists who talk about that AI will never collapse, it will just get smarter and smarter and smarter. But there's a theory amongst AI academics who talk about the notion of model collapse. I talk about it, though, as the notion of discovery collapse. And this is where new ideas, novel approaches and theories and innovative solutions are no longer supported, because instead of us being able to use data to challenge the veracity of our new ideas, that data becomes so poor and so consuming of bad generative AI data that we are unable to generate new discoveries. And we end up in this state of what I've referred to as discovery collapse. Knowing that it's really important to point out that when I use the word new when talking about what generative AI can create, it never creates something new. It creates something that is replicating something that already exists. It's an answer to a question. The newness, the innovation and invention is only a product of the things that it's trained on, not on sparking and creativity. So another pop culture reference for those of you who remember Rugrats. We're all doomed, right? This is the kind of, generative AI. We're all having to do it, and it's not the right thing that we want, and it's going to be terrible. No, I don't think that's the case. So I want to posit two things that can be done right at the level of whatever level you're engaging with students, engaging with thinking about AI in jobs, and engaging if you go right up to the level of curricular design, program design, or even, God forbid, being the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Artificial Intelligence. The first of those is the critical university and what it means to be critical. What does that mean for me? It means the capability of developing and applying skills of critical literacy. So understanding how you be critical. We talk about criticality all the time. We say you've got to be critical. You've got to learn how you can look at something and go that's right and that's wrong. I like this. I don't like that. This theory weighs more heavily than that theory. But that takes a literacy to do that. So how do we develop people's capabilities to have that literacy? How do we privilege knowledge and expertise? We're nowhere in the era of the end of the expert. But how do we privilege knowledge and expertise so they have value? How do we assess students for learning? How do we design an assessment task that they learn by doing and not just assessment of learning? Oh, well, we need to prove that they have actually done it. Both those things have to coexist, but we can't have one privileged over the other. I really like the improv version of yes and. So the idea of criticality is, yes, you've told me this answer, and what does it mean? Yes, you've generated a most likely probable response, and what next? And how do I use it? Because the and bit is where the individual student comes in. This is not about stopping AI, but understanding why it works and how it works in the way it does. And it sits in the argument that in order to understand something, in order to find meaning in something, meaning is socially constructed and contested. AI is not social. It is not your plastic pal who's fun to be with. AI cannot construct meaning. Only you reading it and you using it and interpreting it can construct its meaning. The other half of that is the creative university. And that notion of how we actually use AI in a creative way, I think is really interesting. So I talk a lot about creating different things. I talk a lot about creating experiences. How do you create an experience for students that they remember, that lasts for them, that's resonant, that will come back to them in 3, 5, 10 years' time? How do you create that experience in the class that will help them remember and understand and apply the knowledge they're learning, and not just go, I remember these 10 things for the exam and I've forgotten it the moment I walk out? How do you create connections between these things? The AI is not very good at finding connections. Humans find connections. One of the most important projects I've ever worked on nearly 15 years ago at the University of Greenwich in the UK was how we brought together people from about 10 different disciplines to improve how blind people who are visually impaired can walk around a city. And that had medical people, it had social care, it had psychology, it had architects, it had urban designers and planners, it had business people, it had government experts. Those connections made it a better project. The whole was greater than the sum of its parts. It's about creating discoveries, an opportunity of finding something new and totally new knowledge, but also the capability of doing that in a discontinuous way. I.e., you don't have to go, I have to learn to crawl before I walk. I actually maybe find out something and reverse engineer how that thing worked. Like, here's my, and I'm in business, here's my finished profit and loss statement. Now go back and deconstruct it back to the original transactions. That's just as important as being able to go the other way. So discontinuity, I think, has got a strong power. And I've written a lot about that on my blog, peterbryant.org, if you want to go and have a look at it. There's a lot of detail around that. But what it really is, and this is another really example of, this is about literacy. And I've talked about these as creative literacies. This is a prompt that Mikey P, I've just picked this randomly, used to generate those 4 images. There is a literacy to what Mikey P has had to do in there. Yep, some of it's descriptive. He wanted 2 attractive people. He wanted them paddleboarding and wanted them in the Caribbean. But then there's photographic literacy. What is a Hasselblad? Like, how does a Hasselblad look? What does it do differently to other things? Light intensity, the kind of tropes and mediums of wildlife photography or brooding. Like, that's a literacy. That's not someone going, come up with 2 hot people on paddleboards. That actually takes as much skill to describe that in order to generate those images in a very different way, a different set of skills to the set of skills that it would take to take that photo. Are they more or easier? That's an argument for the context, but it requires a particular literacy. So I'm going to finish this up. Knowledge and creativity. This comes from Michael Peters and Peter Yandrich. Peter Yandrich being the editor of Post-Digital Science and Education. And I've just lost my slide share. Sorry, just give me a bit back. There we go. Knowledge and creativity become the most important commodities, and the ability to produce these commodities, which are often elusive and irrational, is the key to economic success. Their argument here is that our task, the purpose of education, is to produce the creative individual. And it is that person that becomes rare, unpredictable, and subject to interpretation. And more particularly, they went on to describe this, That's what makes them human. And that's what education is about. It's a human skill. To follow on from that, Andrew Klobuchar, who wrote a piece in Literature and Computation, a book called Literature and Computation, which was The Shepherds of Electric Sheep, another reference to Philip K. Dick, said, as artists and writers already understand, AI cannot replace human creativity and storytelling as an epistemologically driven tool. It can't replace our capability to learn through creativity. Yet it can, with skill, be controlled and used to enhance the aesthetic aims, to question, if not disrupt, knowledge systems. That notion of creative literacy and how the sort of skill that AI can be used to create something, to do something like the creation of the Beatles Now and Then, which without AI would have been impossible to do. So what I'm going to ask you to, what I'm finishing on, is the notion of harnessing the random. Now, this is actually a conversation that I'd had with Laurie, actually, a few weeks ago when he was here visiting in Sydney, which is one of the things that AI, I think, can do is it can, through the virtue of this most likely probable answer, create the opportunity for serendipity. I asked the Midjourney, the platform I use, to literally imagine A, just the letter A. And it came up with these 4 completely distinct, different images. There is something that you can harness from that randomness. The kind of, you used to get magnetic poetry for your fridge, and you used to be able to randomly put words together. There's something that comes from serendipity. It can be a useful creative tool, but as Klobuchar says, it's how you harness it and how you engage it. So thank you very much. That's what I was going to talk about. That's the link to the 2 blogs that I write about these things on. Dieberg.blog is an educational research blog run by the research group that I'm chair of here at the University of Sydney. And that's my personal blog, which has got a lot of the stuff that I've written about AI. And I would be more than happy to link in with people, or people want to drop me an email as well. And I will stop sharing there.
That's great. Thanks so much, Peter. Such a fantastic and wide-ranging talk there. Lots of really great pop culture references and sci-fi references throughout, which I know is something that you like to do, but I think really kind of helps people engage with the topic. Always great to hear about the University of Banford. Just in case people didn't get the introduction to that bit of video, that is actually satire. Don't write me angry emails, or worse, don't write me emails saying that you're fully in favor of everything that was described in the video. Anyway, yeah, really liked all the happy brown cows and the slop examples. I see Laurie has added your blog address in the chat there as well. So look, loads of new questions and takeaways for us to consider. We still have a little bit of time for questions, but I might ask people now, just in case we don't get time, to join me in showing appreciation with some virtual or real applause for Peter there and for his talk. Thank you for such a great talk, and thanks to everyone who came along, asked all the questions. There's clearly a real hunger and interest in the topic and in your presentation there. So thanks so much. Hope to speak to you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody. It was a really enjoyable hour.